Hello, my name is Amy Marie Babcock. I have been studying with Artemisia de Vine for the past year, learning the divinery method for finding out the deeper meaning behind sexual fantasies and how to work with them and how to explore them further. Before I started working with Artemisia, I had been very interested in sexual education. I'd been taking lots of classes. I had good amounts of work with things like the Wheel of Consent and like a Pro, which is the longer version of that program with Betty Martin, all kinds of classes like kink and BDSM, really wanting to understand, really wanting to get to the more sophisticated levels of how these things play into my life, my spiritual life, how I integrate them into my own understandings of who I am, how I show up in the world, how I be an erotic being in a way that has integrity and robustness and really make an impact with being an alive, erotic human being. So that's how I arrived at being able to study with Artemisia. I was really excited by the idea of being able to take something that's taboo in lots of circles to be able to work with my sexual fantasies and be able to explore them in ways that have dignity and surprise and elements of self-discovery and self-understanding and compassion and what I didn't know then but came to learn very quickly how genius sexual fantasies really are and how much they are working in support of my wholeness, my ability to grow, and my ability to show up as a vibrant human being. I started down the road of working with the body specifically because I have been trained as a pastor and my background is theological and I earned a Master of Divinity. Sexuality and spirituality were always something I was very interested in, the intersection of. But I'd realized that I'd always really approached that from the cerebral or theological side of things. So I actually became a massage therapist because I wanted to understand the body on the body's terms. And soon after I did that, I realized that I wanted to understand eroticism in the language of the body and in the language of desire, the goodness of these things, and to hear from them directly. I did begin taking classes and then eventually practicing being a coach for intimacy and sexuality. Then I was absolutely astounded and overjoyed to find Artemisia de Vine, who has been working in this very arena, the intersection of spirituality and sexual fantasy, in a way that gives dignity and real value to the function of sexual fantasies in our lives. So even though it wasn't a particular niche of mine at the time, when I saw the kind of work that she was doing and the sophisticated thought and the beauty of the framework that she brings, I was absolutely convinced and compelled that I needed to work with her. And it's been an absolutely fantastic decision. I had no idea how good of a decision it was when I made it, but it's something that I look back on and I feel grateful for literally every day. It's become a topic of conversation in my personal relationships with my friends to really to value and to appreciate and to be able to talk without shame about sexual fantasies, to really actually understand the beauty of what they are offering into our lives. And I don't know that I ever actually would have been able to encounter this approach outside of the work with Artemisia. So one of the first things that Artemisia teaches in the divinery method is the desire compass. And the desire compass is an approach that allows you to develop a deeper relationship with one's own desire. Because I'd been working on strengthening my relationship with myself and my understanding of my sexuality, I thought that I had a fairly decent relationship with desire compared to what it was when I was younger, which was a lot of repression and a lot of making desire the enemy. So I thought I had come a long way in my relationship with desire at that point. The desire compass accentuated that in such a profound way in helping me to really see that desire is reliable. Desire is trustworthy. And that's what I didn't really know. I had such a conflicted relationship with desire because I had lots of sexual energy, I had lots of sexual interest, and yet I wasn't entirely sure how to trust that my desire would guide me well. So, what I learned in the desire compass was how to actually name desire, listen to it, pay attention, and trust it for what it was saying, because desire isn't the only voice speaking. It is, however, a really important one. And so to give it the dignity of listening and to accept it on its word, that was one of the very big lessons that I learned early on, to not try to talk my desire out of what it wanted. And previously, if I heard my desire, I might try to hear it, but also offer it some other options that seemed more palatable to me. So I was often in the good girl approach of, oh, I hear you, but do you think this might be a little bit better? Or how about this one over here that seems just a little easier to digest, or maybe acceptable to other people, or even more acceptable to myself? So the idea of listening and trusting that as we discern and as we navigate the interests of desire, we will come to a completely valid, legitimate, important, trustworthy point of view. And I really did not understand that before. I recently was thinking about some transgressive fantasies that I've been playing with, really pondering how before I wouldn't have even been able to approach that kind of play because I would have been too scared that that meant what that would mean about me, that I was a bad person. Why was I having these thoughts? Why was I getting aroused by these particular scenes? So before, I wouldn't have been even able to play with those fantasies. But having the divinery method, I began realizing every desire has a beautiful thing that it is wanting to accomplish for us. Something that is not going to happen really any other way. That desire is the way to understand myself, what I need, what I want, what I'm scared of. Desire's actually working on my behalf in this very sophisticated way, but I have to trust it in order to be able to get there. And so as I was playing with these sexual fantasies and dissecting them and really looking closely at what was going on, what I realized was the desires were getting at something very sweet, very innocent about my humanity, about the desire and the need to be wanted, about the desire to belong, about the desire to matter to others, to myself, to the world. And so here I was playing with these perhaps repulsive, transgressive fantasies, and at the very center of them was my desire to be loved, to matter. And I was really struck by the innocence of that, the goodness of that. At the heart of smut, as Artemisia would say, were these very innocent, beautiful, life-giving, needs and desires. And I would not have gotten to them the way that I did outside of the exploration of sexual fantasy. Saying a lot for somebody who's been in pursuit of God through academic study, through a lifetime of jobs in the faith and service fields. So the idea that in all of this study, in all of my career and my vocation and all the different places that it's taken me, the idea that sexual fantasy is the place where I really get to see the goodness and the innocence and the beauty of humanity and of my humanity, I think that's saying quite a bit. The divinery method has had significant impact on my personal sex life and romantic relationship. I actually got into a new significant partnership, and I had been studying the divinery method at that point. And because of that, I was able to listen really carefully and without judgment or a sense of wrongness or badness to my partner in a way that he had never experienced before. And sexual fantasy is something that is particular of interest to both of us. And so to be able to offer a way of being able to play with sexual fantasy in a way that brings more variety, more understanding, more sense of self, more sense of personal desire, more sense of real understanding about what our fears are and where our vulnerabilities are and how to get at that with sensitivity and compassion and effectiveness. One of the things that I learned early on in the divinery method was how to listen with compassion to desire, and also how to separate out what's my desire versus what my partner's desire is. And that was so huge for me because I personally have been very accustomed to following the desire of my partner. And because I have an erotic blueprint of being a shapeshifter, I really am able to very easily and with a lot of joy follow the other person's pleasure and the other person's desire. And what I didn't realize was that even though that gave me a lot of enjoyment, it wasn't my actual desire. And so I was able to learn how I get to bring my desire into the bedroom and my desire into sexual fantasy. And particularly because my partner and I have pretty similar turn-ons, it's been especially useful because I would have imagined beforehand that having a similar fantasy and being aroused by a similar fantasy would be really great. And in a lot of ways it is. But the tricky thing can be that we might assume that both of our desires are in this fantasy, when in fact, we really need to work with one person or the others at a time in order to really understand what's going on for them. And that's exactly what happened with me. I was so accustomed to following my partner's desire with a lot of joy that it was actually easy for me to leave myself out. It became really clear really fast that leaving myself out was not useful. And in fact, the best thing that I could do to enhance my own enjoyment and his as well was to actually bring my desire, not just my approval of his desire, but my approval of my own. So it's been an incredible change of trajectory for me to really understand that bringing my whole self, telling the truth about what arouses me is incredibly important to a hot sex life. I really thought, because of my bent and orientation towards service, I really thought it was in the best interest of me and my partner to offer my attention to his interests and his desires. And that is useful. what I didn't really understand was the real gift that I'm giving by offering the truth of my desire into our relationship. Using the divinery method has really increased the level of intimacy and pleasure in a relationship where we already enjoyed sex. So, for example, I find that it was rather vulnerable to share my real desires. I thought that it was easier for me to play the role of supporting the other person's desire. What I didn't realize about that was that it was actually a pretty convenient way for me to hide my own vulnerability, because it's actually pretty vulnerable and intimate to share sexual desires with somebody else. So instead of just hopping on his bandwagon about what was his turn on and kind of following that and getting enough enjoyment from it, it actually really brought me alive to share my own desires and to be vulnerable and intimate in that way. I hadn't realized actually giving more insight into what was going on in my inner world. It meant a lot to him. It meant a lot to him to hear what was really true for me. And that's one of the things that Artemisia has always taught me. Tell the truth about it. We always find something that's true about our arousal. We can always find something to share that when we're looking for the panning for gold, which is one of our favorite practices, after we've had an intimate experience, we've learned how to pan for gold, which is to look for the most arousing, exciting, juicy nugget of what we've each experienced. And at first, I was not used to focusing on what I thought was the most arousing. And so it actually took me a good bit of work to learn to find that. What do I think was the juiciest, most arousing part of the whole thing? And when I shared that, and when I learned to say, which is the practice, well, what would make that even hotter? And then share that with him, he was both so excited to have actual information that he could act on and really enhance pleasure for me and for us. I was surprised it was so easy and so effective to actually give information that he could work with and that he could play with me. I guess I thought that intimacy gets increased by the amount that I give. What I didn't understand is that intimacy gets increased by the amount that I reveal. After all the learning that I did about how to create a remarkable sex life, I learned the divinery method. I didn't know how much better it could get. It made me really interested in being able to share that with other people, especially people who are already having a pretty good sex life. There is a way of being able to understand yourself, your partner, and the play that you can have that exponentially accentuates and builds on the good sex life that you might already have. And even for people who aren't used to working with sexual fantasies or who maybe have discounted them, but still have a role in their own, maybe their own private sex lives, or maybe not even understanding how you might work with them together without feeling threatened. That's one of the things that I actually learned that has also made remarkable impact on my sex life and my partnership. And something that I would love to teach other people is how to be able to work with your partner and share your sexual fantasies in ways that are not threatening, in ways that actually contribute to your sex life, because there's something you're sharing together. There's something that you are revealing. There's something that's true about you that you are divulging to a significant other. And instead of that being scary and threatening, which it can really seem like at first, it actually can be the basis of building a really robust, vital sex life and intimacy world together. I'm excited about being able to work with people who have a curiosity about their own sexual fantasies, who have a curiosity about how to work with their partners in using sexual fantasy to explore things that you really can't sometimes in the real world, is that sexual fantasy is not a second class sex act. I think of it now as a multi-dimensional portal where anything is available. So you can transcend time and space in a sexual fantasy. You can bring in whatever you want. You can have whatever elements you want, whatever environment. Everything that's available in your imagination is available in a sexual fantasy. So not only is it not a second class sexual act, it can be one of the most freeing, liberating, unlimited experiences that we can create in sex. So I've really come to appreciate sexual fantasy as its own beautiful sex act, second to none. I wanted to share an example of working with sexual fantasy before the divinery method and working with sexual fantasy after the divinery method. When my partner and I were first learning the divinery method, how we did not employ it and it did not go the way that we had expected. So we were working on a sexual fantasy of his, and he made a request of me, which I was glad to do. And I did all the things that he asked. At the end of it, it was satisfying enough. But then a couple days later, when we were discussing it, he said, that fantasy just did not work for me the way that I thought it would. And I said, oh, really? Well, tell me more about that. And he said, well, your tone of voice was aloof and a little humiliating, when really what I thought that she would be doing, the woman in the fantasy, would be warm and connective. And I thought, oh, we didn't actually take time to set it up the way that Artemisia taught us, so that I really understood the attitude, the posture, the tone of voice that his fantasy woman was embodying. So because what the fantasy woman in my head looked completely different than the fantasy woman in his head, even though she was doing the exact same things. What I realized was that it absolutely matters the other person's desire, the way the other person is envisioning this, in order for their turn on to really get stoked and to flame up. It really is important to understand these very subtle nuances that make all the difference. So it's not just about playing with sexual fantasy. It's about really engaging it in ways that dive deeply into the real turn-ons that exist for ourselves and our partners. And that's the way that we really build intimacy and really hot sex. So if anything of what I've said sparks an interest for you and you'd really like to study the divinery method for yourself, which I highly recommend, you can tell Artemisia that Amy Marie Babcock sent you and that you'd like to study the divinery method with her. And she will give you a significant discount, which is incredibly generous of her, and her way of making it accessible for people to really understand this, really employ it in their own lives, employ it in their own business practices with your own clients. So it's a remarkable opportunity to learn with Artemisia as somebody who is a real genius in this field. It's not every day that you will encounter somebody with the vision, the framework, the understanding, the compassion, and the real desire for people to live robust, hearty sexual lives, and to really bring that into all of who they are and all of how they live in the world. So you have a really remarkable opportunity to study with Artemisia de Vine, and I would highly recommend that you consider it. And if you're interested in working with me, I'd be glad to have a conversation with you about where this can go. You can find me on Facebook, Amy Marie Babcock.